à faire face et dont l'objectif final n'était pas la destruction de l'État russe, mais la simple volonté de faire entrer Moscou dans le rang pour abattre définitivement la puissance britannique.
Well, it is quite difficult to briefly cover what I would like to make clear with regard to these military conflicts, but I would like to dwell upon at least some of them. Firstly, the Moscow campaign by Napoleon was the last so-called traditional war, which Russia had to face, and the ultimate goal of which was to destroy the Russian state. And the strive to make Moscow to comply with the agreements in order to destroy the British power.
Sans parler des crises au Yémen, en Irak, en Libye ou en Afrique, l'enjeu pour l'oligarchie anglo-saxonne est toujours le même depuis Mackinder, contrôler le Rhineland pour mieux étouffer le Heartland.
Well, be this to Chechen wars, the aggression in Syria and military conflict in the Donbass, well, not to say anything about the crisis in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, or Africa, the task for the Anglo-Saxon oligarchs is still the same since the times or epoch of Mackinder, to control the homeland in order to strangle the heartland.
Ces dernières, bien sûr, sous le contrôle des anglo-saxons, il est devenu parfaitement clair à partir de la guerre de Géorgie de 2008 que les forces armées russes étaient redevenues opérationnelles et aptes à défendre non seulement leur territoire, mais aussi celui de leurs alliés Ossètes et Abkhazes.
Well, if in Chechnya, the Russian army, which inherited the Soviet Union army traditions, it was very difficult to vanquish the Wahhabite terrorism, which were manipulated by Turkey and the monarchies of the Persian Gulf. After the Blitzkrieg in Georgia in 2008, it was absolutely obvious that the Russian military forces have become able to fight well again, and they're well able to protect not only their own territory, but the territory of their allies, those in Ossetia or in Abkhazia.
Mais il est certain, en revanche, qu'aucun des missiles lancés n'atteignit sa cible, ce qui entraîna la décision de Barack Obama d'annuler l'ordre d'attaque.
Well, the West was still more surprised when in summer 2013, Russia all of a sudden made to stop bombarding Syria with Tomahawk missiles on the part of the United States militaries. So far, it is not quite clear, even for attentive observers, whether that strike was made by the Russian army with the help of the radio-electronic countermeasures or with the use of Zenith systems S-400 or their combinations. But undoubtedly, the American missiles missed their targets. Which led for the decision by Barack Obama to cancel the order about the attack. Well, we could say that Russia has restored their military potential in two stages. In the period from 2000 to 2010, Russia has revamped their military equipment in order to protect our own territory. And this is what I call the policy of the shield, where it is important not to allow the NATO to use their strategic advantage on the part of the military and air and sea forces. Well, the second stage covered 2010 to 2020. And this is what I call the policy of a javelin, when Russia managed to develop a whole arsenal of the revolutionary offense weapons, including the hypersound possibilities, which bring to a naught the ability on the part of the NATO to offend. So, in such a way, over 20 years, Russia has developed the defense policy, which cracked down on the attempts of the Western headquarters
que nous observons depuis
and
quelques années et vis-à-vis desquels la Russie
uh,
s'investit nettement moins bien
at the moment, we are witnessing the revolution in the martial arts, but it is leading to the revival of another kind of war, a hybrid war, the deployment of which is being witnessed for over several last years. And Russia is quite less prepared for waging hybrid wars. And I believe that we should come out with an exact definition of a cultural war or war of cultures. Well, rephrasing Clausewitz, we could determine a war or cultures, define a war cultures as a continuation of a military conflict, which has been waged in different ways.
Durant les 2 premières décennies du XXIe siècle, et cela était vital, car si elle ne l'avait pas fait, je suis certain que l'OTAN aurait attaqué la Russie. Sur le plan de la guerre culturelle, en revanche, l'Occident continue de marquer des points et a pénétré dans l'esprit du peuple russe, et notamment de sa jeunesse, qui reste en grande partie fascinée par le mode de vie occidental.
To finalize, I would like to note that in military respect, Russia has made a very impressive progress since the very beginning of the 21st century. Otherwise, it could have been attacked. On the other hand, what has to do with the war in the cultural sphere? Well, detrimental aspects are still penetrating the minds of young people, which is of great importance.
À mettre au point des calibres, des avant-gardes, des Kinjal, des Krassour, des Bastion et beaucoup d'autres armes encore qui lui ont donné l'avantage stratégique qui permettra sans doute de faire reculer l'OTAN, que Londres et Washington le veuillent ou non. En revanche, pour faire reculer l'Occident et notamment son poison culturel que l'on voit se déverser tous les jours en Russie par tous les canaux où il infecte l'âme russe, il vous faudra, à vous, amis russes, il faudra replonger dans la littérature russe du XIXe siècle, où tout ce qui se déroule aujourd'hui était déjà annoncé. Je m'arrêterai là, je vous remercie, sinon je prends beaucoup trop de temps. Merci à vous pour votre attention.
Well, as to the modern Russia, it has managed to develop the achievements of the Soviet time military and industrial complex and to develop missiles of the caliber, Dega, Avangard, Krasukh, and other types. But in order to make the West to step back and in order to stop the spread of Western values, which are being translated on all channels and infecting the Russian souls, it is necessary to appeal to the Russian literature of the 19th century, which has already covered all important problems which we are currently witnessing in the modern society.
Last year, we published this book on war crimes and human rights crimes in Ukraine. This was the result of work of many people who had been monitoring the situation in Ukraine, visiting many sites. They're speaking to eyewitnesses. And as for information on cultural war, many years, a few years ago, we worked on the situation in Syria and how the disinformation was used there and how the white casks were used to inform and disinform, misinform many people. And now I give the floor to Natalia Narochnitskaya, my colleague of Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation. My dear colleagues, Maxim Sergeyevich, thank you. And I greet you all, and especially Emmanuel Leroy. I remember our meeting in Paris and hope that we will be able to meet again at one of the conferences where you would be able to speak of your perspective and I will share mine. As a historian, I would like to, especially for our foreign guests and participants, to speak briefly on certain milestones, because in the West, unfortunately, there is a prevalent ignorance of Russian history, accompanied by the lack of desire to learn about it. And this makes today's propaganda very effective in stating that Ukraine was an independent state for many centuries, then occupied by Russia and Soviet Union, enslaved and oppressed, and now regaining freedom, democracy, and independence. And some of the historians now make outrageous remarks. For example, saying that the Prince Vladimir of Kiev was the Ukrainian prince and his son, Yuri Dolgoruki, the Prince of Moscow, was the outrageous Slav who wanted to establish a Russian kingdom. And some of the books on history in Ukraine say that the Ukars were a people that basically established, laid the foundation for European culture and civilization. Something that can never be historically accurate and can but amuse, if not shock, any true historian. And some claim that the Muscovites are a mixture of Tatars and Hungarian and Finnish tribes, while Ukrainians are the Aryan race of Europe. And Grushevsky, with all of his anti-Russian sentiment, did not stay in the West, but moved back to the Soviet Union and even gained the position in the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And in terms of Golodomor, the figure of speech used by Ukrainian propaganda by for the assumed operations against Ukrainian civilians to starve them by Bolsheviks, but the person in charge of that was a Ukrainian nationalist, and he was not acting against Ukrainians per se, but he was acting against a specific class of wealthy peasants who were very religious, who were very anti-communist, and the operation was aimed at eliminating this class And the same operation was going on in Ukraine and all across Russia as well. And there was no anti-Ukrainian focus in it. And we see many works and publications on Russian-Ukrainian relations. And I stated in my publications that we are way too close with Ukrainians, almost intimate. And the West tries to turn us into Serbia and Croatia. And one of the main instruments used is the region of Galicia in Ukraine that has traditionally been anti-Orthodox, anti-Russian, pro-Catholic, pro-Uniate, and anti-Moscow. And in the attempts to justify the separation of Ukrainians from Russians, and this differentiation between the two cultures, we really see how many people are going way too far. Nobody's against Ukrainian language or Ukrainian identity that has given us so many songs and folk stories. But in order to justify this independent existence, we see an attempt to state that for centuries, Ukraine had been struggling for independence and had been fighting for its own identity, which does not stand true. And before the First World War, Russian Minister Durnovo warned the Russian Emperor and said, the only thing we can lose here is Galicia. And but if we lose Galicia, we may as well lose the empire. The region that has not united neither with the Catholics nor with the Orthodox and remained their identity as the only true Christian church in the region, the only true Christian church in Europe. And many Catholics and Orthodox alike failed to understand the Union Church that was existing in between the two, with Eastern Rite and Catholic dogma. And in order to stay in power, Kravchuk used the Galician nationalism. And now, once this genie was out of the bottle, we could not easily put it back. And unfortunately, the Russian policy was very short-sighted. We focused on the economic benefits of union with Russia and friendliness with Russia. This was at the times of Prime Minister Chernomyrdin, especially, where Russia was playing mostly the economic card. And yet the West was playing the culture card while being ignorant to the culture and to the language and to the history, but very effective in their propaganda. And I believe that an average Westerner is an honest, well-meaning person, but is easily influenced by propaganda. But what would Europe prefer now is not an open war, but this constant plague that can, this constant wound, open wound that could be used against Russia. As for Anglo-Saxons, yes, they have enslaved Europe long ago, and the United States couldn't care less for Europe. And even if some of the missiles hit Belarus or other neighboring country or Ukraine, the West would not blink an eye. The West want provocation, want to provoke Russia for any action that could later on be used as a justification for seizing any diplomatic effort and presenting Russia as the evil empire that cannot be talked to. And we have seen it happening in reaction to President Putin's statements on the threats to Russian national safety by NATO. But we know what would have happened should Russia extend its military influence to, for example, Mexico and plant its bases in Mexico. We all remember all too well the Cuba conflict. And we should monitor the situation very closely, the situation with Ukraine very closely. But I, as a historian, as an expert on the relations between the countries and not being a government official, I could tell that if we face more sanctions, and we're very likely to do that, I would say that if we are to pay for something, then we are to pay for gains rather than for losses. As for Donetsk and Lugansk region, I have relatives there, and just today, one of my friends was to go into the region today by bus. She could not get there. I know, I hear from people about the shaking walls, the broken windows. Ukraine is provoking and is launching many provocations, having the license from the West. But Ukraine itself is so diverse in its regions and its mentality. For the Westerners, it is unthinkable that this tiny little region of Chigirin Republic that stated its will to join with Russia, all the rest of Ukraine was fought for by Russia and joined to Ukraine by Russia, by Russian forces fighting the Polish, the Lithuanians, and joining the territory to the empire. And the territory that the Ukraine has now is the territory that Ukraine has thanks to Russia, and it's a territory that is very diverse. And of course, the West will never acknowledge this diversity and will always be against Ukraine following the Minsk agreement, and will never recognize neither Donbass nor Lugansk, nor the identity of Odessa or Kharkiv. And they will be using the nationalism and the diversity as a tool in fighting against and causing divisions, more divisions. But one has to fight the historian ignorance and speak more on the history. And we know how in World War II, Ukrainians and Russians fought together against the common enemy. And I was privileged to read the CIA documents on the CIA intelligence that stated that anti-Soviet sentiment is moderate in Ukraine, but there is a strong anti-Russian sentiment in Galicia. But acting slowly but surely, we may use that and benefit from that anti-Russian sentiment, making it more widespread and later on traditional and canonic, making it more like a main tune of the Ukrainian policy. So we see a lot of things at play: national, cultural, religious, political, and all of that now culminates in the situation as it is now.
Well, I would like to make a couple of comments. Natalia has really covered the way it is all being perceived in the West. In fact, the political class of Western countries demonstrates absolute lack of proficiency. Ms. Truss quite recently has spoken about the Tartars and Mongols separately invading Russia in ancient times, having no idea about the way it all happened in the Russian history. She had no idea that those were she believed that those were absolute different and separate invasions. And she stated also that Great Britain would never agree to acknowledge the sovereignty of Russia over the Voronezh region. Well, she has no idea where actually Ukraine or Russia are situated. She has no idea about the situation of the countries on the map, to say the least. And Natalia Alexeyevna spoke about such elements of Ukrainian myths, and which, unfortunately, the Ukrainian kids are being taught. And currently, they have published a textbook in the Ukrainian history. And I should say that such a great number of absolutely absurd facts, quite obvious for a well-educated person, causes the feeling that it is beyond any human understanding. The Ukrainians are taught that the so-called ancient Yukars, the ancient predecessors of the Ukrainian people, used to exist prior to the Maya civilization, prior to the ancient Egypt, not to say anything about ancient Rome. And the Ukrainian kids are taught that the Ukrainian civilization is the most ancient in the world. It is absurd, but alas, it is a fact. We have already mentioned Grushevsky, and prior to that, the history of Rusians and the history of the so-called ancient Yukars used to be written quite a long period ago. And of course, all these books and works contain a lot of absurdities and distorted historical facts. And we do remember that during the Second World War, the government of Ukrainian nationalists was brought to power in Kiev, and it was done with the help of the German forces forces. They had to flee in 1941, when again the Ukrainian nationalists tried to resume their power in Kiev, and they also used the same examples and the same facts against Russia, to derogate Russia, to mar Russia's reputation. And now I would like to give the floor to Igor Demyanovich. You are welcome. He represents Chernogoria, and do please stick to the agenda. Let us stay within the limit of 5 to 7 minutes. Otherwise, we won't be able. Otherwise, we won't be able to cover all the reports today. So I would like to speak about cracking down on fake news. Fighting the fake news is a loophole for the NATO countries and for the alliance countries, which we've been witnessing over the recent years. And the media platforms which are trying to crack down on the fake news can be found in Montenegro as well. And our country has spent over $10 million in order to do that. We are aware of the threats to the modern civilization on the part of different Western countries. And currently, we are witnessing a hysteria with regard to the alleged attacks of Russia against Ukraine. And over 10, allegedly, they claim to have registered over 10 attacks on the part of Russia against. And the starting date of the alleged war of Russia against Ukraine has been transferred by the Westerners for already 10 times. And the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, the Canadian Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, and representatives of the United States and of some European countries are supporting these absurd facts. Speaking about the facts which we observed during the war in Yugoslavia, it is difficult to say who contributed more to spreading fake news, either the journalists, Christian Amanpour from CNN, Christian Amanpour from CNN, or the state officials. In February 1992 in Lisbon, with the mediation of Mr. Tiller, the representatives of Bosnia and Herzegovina signed a treaty under which, under the Switzerland model, they had to form a federation which is made up of cantons. But the leader of Bosnian Muslims, as you remember, the term of Bosnians was introduced not long before the end of the war. So he met the representatives of the United States in Belgrade and immediately withdrew his signature from the plan of Couturier. So this war has taken over 100,000 lives. And some months after, and still during the war, there was a launch of a campaign against our president, Slobodan Milosevic. He used to be called the Balkan Butcher. And during all the Yugoslavian wars, no representative of national minorities ever threatened any human values. Over 100,000 Croatians, Muslims, and other people used to live on that territory. But look what's happening nowadays. Of interest is that the Western countries try to make up, to stage incidents. At the very beginning of the war, there took place a mysterious explosion which took the lives of several people. And the introduction of unprecedented sanctions on the part of the UN Security Council forbade all foreign trade, including importing oil. And as you know, our countries have practically no own sources of oil supply. And these sanctions, unfortunately, were voted for by Yury Vorontsov, the first ambassador of Russia in the United Nations organization. At that time, Russia didn't abstain, just like the state of Zimbabwe. And this and Mr. Louis Mackenzie in Sarajevo expressed doubts with regard to the official version of the responsibility for the events. And against the background of the Serbian propaganda, General Mackenzie had to leave his position in 1993. And no less suspicious incidents took place in Sarajevo in the market in 1995, which caused aggression of the NATO against the Serbian Republic. And right after the end of the war, there was a crisis in Kosovo.
And Metohija. And the key reason for NATO aggression against Serbia and Montenegro was the assumed massacre in the village of Rečak. Years after Helena Ranta, the head of Finnish group of Pataljana, of the scientists, was told that the head of OSCE mission was threatening her in order to keep her silent about the fact that those who were killed in Račan were not civilians, but Albanian terrorists. Most of the victims had powder on their hands, thus having used having been shooting before being killed. And Finnish doctors and experts so many other evidence to the victims being militants. Within the 78 days of NATO aggression against Serbia, it is hard to say who spread more fake news. The Minister of Defense of the UK, Lord Robertson, or his German colleague, Rudolf Scharping, who supported the bombings of Serbia. And we have documents on their support to do nationalistic, to orchestrate nationalistic and anti-Albanian actions in Kosovo in order to support a NATO aggression against Serbia. And the same people were spreading various data, and they spoke about 10,000 of Albanians dying from the hand of Serbians, which was less than the total number of Albanians officially residing in Kosovo then. And one of the targets of NATO was the building of the national television of Serbia, and the bombing of their building led to 16 civilian casualties. And within the last 8 years in Ukraine, we have seen many events that evoke the memories of the 1990s Yugoslavia. The hysteria that we see spread by the fake news and propaganda of the West about the alleged Russian attack on Russia is nothing but a part of a hybrid war. And the apocalyptic messages all across the Western media threaten the economic well-being of Russia and threaten Ukraine with total demolition. And the possibility of war between Russia and Ukraine is not something that neither Ukrainians nor Russians want, even those who are anti-Ukrainians or anti-Russians. The possible war between Russia and Ukraine would serve to the good only to those who started the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina and who started the war in Yugoslavia. And the key to keeping peace would be in the ability of the Kiev authorities to stand against the influence of Washington and London. I do remember the events in Yugoslavia, what you mentioned, the situation with organ transplants. We remember how Serbians were attacked and kidnapped for organ transplantation. And Kashim Tachi, the future president of Kosovo, was in charge of the operation. And this was well documented. And the former prosecutor of the tribunal at Hague was speaking against it, but there was no investigation done, and the investigation was stopped. And we remember the events, but our next colleague is Alexander Malkevich, also speaking on the topic of fake news. This is your expertise, so we give the floor to you, Alexander. Yes. The information war is a hard topic for all of us. And the war is on and the pressure is on. Starting from yesterday in Kramatorsk, we have the operational media center functioning in order to improve the communication and inform people of what is going on in reality. This media center is located near to the action area, and many American experts located in the area are bombarding the region on a daily basis. There was a publication in the New York Times stating that a large group of American experts came to Ukraine to protect it from the Russian attacks. But what we see actually happening is a huge campaign of hysteria, fake news, misinformation, and information attacks orchestrated by that very group, with many messages about what is allegedly happening in Donbass, and what we see happening at the time as people are fleeing the regions. For example, that the men that could be enlisted cannot leave the Donbas region, or that the people can flee to Russia only if they have Russian passports, if they're Russian citizens. There are so many fake messages that go on in internet, in social media. There is a whole database of phone numbers from which the messages are being sent to various social media groups. And there are many publications in social media that threaten the people who are trying to flee to Russia with messages such as like, don't board the buses will be targeted, the buses will be targeted by provocations from Russia and from the Donbass authorities. There is a lot of suspense built up, and social media are bombarded with these messages. And in Rostov region, social media are targeted, and neighboring regions are targeted by people who are pretending to be Russian citizens, but they're Ukrainian trolls and bots of that center of special operations, and they are inspiring sentiments, the anti-refugee sentiment, anti-migrant sentiment, that these people will rob us of the state funds, and these people will rob us from social benefits, and so on and so forth. And I have already mentioned earlier what I think is the need for informational laws of wartime, and during emergency situations and situations of military action, I think there should be limitations and restrictions imposed on foreign media and international media. The RAIN channel or Echo of Moscow, Echo Moskvy channel are engaged in propaganda against Russia. As for Dozhd, we see what they're doing, but Echo is also giving floor to all sorts of Ukrainian so-called experts who are speaking against Russian army, against the civilians in Donbass. And Dozhd is broadcasting 24/7, basically retelling all the anti-Russian rhetoric of Western SME. But imagine that in 1942, the at the hardest times of Leningrad siege, we would listen to some kind of German propaganda radio speaking against the Soviet army. It would be unthinkable, just like what some of the NGOs are doing, like posting anti-war messages on their buildings.
Well, can you imagine that then Kuibyshev, the representatives of the authorities or so-called activists called the civilians to make peace with the fascist Germany. It is unthinkable, and the people, just ordinary civilians, dwellers of Russia, keep on writing that we are so kind-hearted and graceful and benign to the enemies who are working against us openly on air. And we are all witnessing it. We've more than once discussed it, Maxim, and my colleague, Mr. Shapovalov, are well aware what it is all about. Just look at what's happening. How many more years, days, or months are we going to tolerate it, to put up with it? We can't but react to it adequately. Thank you for your kind attention. And the next speaker will be Mr. Darko Todorotsky, a special correspondent from the Pogled newspaper, Bulgaria. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers of this event, and I would like to speak about the double standards and hypocrisy of the Western countries, especially in the Balkans. And I would like to draw parallels with the situation in Ukraine and in Taiwan. Speaking about the goal of the United States in Europe is for the United States to dominate in Europe and to oust the Chinese and the Europeans from this territory. As we are well aware, the United States have increased their influence in the eastern part of Europe, and China and Russia are being under a serious threat because their representatives are being ousted from the territory of the Balkans. For example, my colleague from Montenegro has spoken about the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we are all aware about the events in Kosovo. The West used to actively support the Kosovo Metohia quasi-state, and at the moment, the West is actively propagating their hypocritical ideas with regard to the Donbas region. The United States and the Western countries keep on saying that in future they will try to resume their presence in Kosovo Metohia. And maybe speaking about the military operations, the Croatian operation will not be suitable to be applied in the Donbas region. There are conflicts in Kosovo under the pressure of the United States and the European Union. So the Macedonian party had to make a treaty with the Albanians. And the United States put heavy pressure on our party. And as we see now, although Great Britain and France act as the guarantors of compliance with this treaty. It helps but little. The same has to do with the conflict in the territory of Donbass. The same is happening in Ukraine, and speaking about the situation around Taiwan, the United States have been supplying arms to Taiwan, alleging that Mr. Putin will resume Russia's influence in Taiwan as well. And this is another evidence of hypocrisy and double standards of the United States and Western countries. And they are trying to make Ukraine to resume the possession of the Donbas territory in a military way. They are ousting China and Russia from the territory of Europe, and that's obvious. Well, I hope that I've managed to be brief. Yes, thank you kindly. You have spoken about the hypocrisy of Western countries, and we are well aware what's happening in the territory of Donbass. A huge Ukrainian army with over 100,000 troops is arriving closer to the borderline, to the line of conflict, and lethal weapons, offensive weapons are being supplied there, including by the Western countries as well. And we see quite clearly what's happening. Even when we were interviewing the victims of the Ukrainian tortures, they used to tell that special services representatives of Ukraine more and more often use the torture with the help of putting people under the water for them to suffocate. They're trying to make the Ukrainian army to deploy the attack against the Donbas territory and their population. And for the dwellers of Donbas, there is a lot to be afraid of. We remember the situation with Mr. Saakashvili and his attempts to influence the events with regard to Ossetia and Abkhazia. And you do remember, although he used to swear that Georgia would never attack those territories, they did attack them. And they advanced into Ossetia and seized Tskhinval. Later on, during the peacemaking operation on the part of the Russian army, they had to withdraw. Sooner or later, the history will make everything clear. But after the visits of some well-known American representatives, we can Mr. Saakashvili again started voicing his position out loud, and we can only suppose and can only guess what he was promised by the representatives of America. They keep on saying that Russia will be afraid, will get frightened, and would never interfere. But there is one more very important idea. I don't think that Mr. Zelensky completely controls the situation in the military forces of Ukraine. Well, you know, he's just a muppet. He's a doll on the strings, operated by some other people from other countries. You remember the representatives of the military forces named Azov, and the right sector, so-called death squads. They openly oppose the people who support the Russian party, and these death squads support the Nazis' position, and these paramilitary troops are well able to start the offensive against the Donbass, and we can't but be concerned about it, because thousands of people are fleeing to Russia because they are well aware what it can all end up with. The next speaker is going to be Mr. Vladimir Zharikhin. Well, he's offline, unfortunately. He used to be with us online, but well, now Mr. Haukur Kauksson, representatives of Iceland. You're welcome.
Hello, dear friends and colleagues. Pro-Western media push the info-political agenda, and we see hybrid war going on, the war that will convert from information war into a full-blown military action. And of course, it tells us that the West and those who lead the parade, the Anglo-Saxons, are getting nervous, for they are afraid of open conflict. And we see very characteristic statements by the British Foreign Office and by the US State Department that they're ready to invest billions and billions of money to fight the misinformation, while Russia is trying to present its objective perspective on what is going on. And of course, we should not forget about the campaigns that are already going on. We know about the state coup in Kazakhstan that has failed, and the events in Belarus that did not lead to the fall of Alexander Lukashenko, although many informational resources were used. Although Tikhanovskaya could be named the real acting president of Belarus. But there is one subject of the international law that is meddling into the Western affairs, and that is an obstacle for the West, and that is Russia. Russia is acting as the main opponent for the West, and the role of China should be studied. It is interesting. Maybe China has some common interest with the US in this, and thus acting the way they do. But despite the colossal struggle that is going on for monopoly on the truth, and monopoly to propagate one's opinions in the big five, the social media, we see a lot of coordinated media effort. And one of the main targets and one of the main programs is presenting Russia in dark colors as an evil empire. And this move is quite effective. And I myself am a correspondent of Iceland media. Pretty much every day we broadcast for Iceland, and our station is the only station in Iceland because the rest of the that speaks the truth. The whole country is in fear of war. People believe the propaganda. Some of them rushing into the stores to stock up on goods. And when you speak to common people, they believe the rhetoric of the state media, of the diplomats, of the universities and experts. But some people do see the gap and do see the absurdity of some claims. So I would say that there is hope. And the common people, as easy they are, although they do fall an easy prey to propaganda, but they do some of their own thinking. And I would say that there is some hope that reason might prevail. Thank you so much. I would like to highlight again that all of these 8 years, Russia has been doing everything in its power to resolve the situation peacefully, and the Minsk agreements have that in mind. The Minsk agreements were signed as Ukraine army was being defeated, and the Donbas forces were on the march and could have accomplished the complete defeat of the Ukrainian forces. So it was not a beneficial situation for Ukraine. And yet Ukraine fails to comply with the Minsk agreement. And the Rada continues to pass the laws that contradict the Minsk agreements. And we hear a lot of claims and statements from the office of the president and the government of Ukraine that speak openly against Minsk agreement and speak about the unwillingness to comply with Minsk agreements and all of that on the license from the West. And now I give the floor to Vladimir Shapovalov.
So we are at the moment trying to render at least moral support to our neighbors in the Donbas region. And Natalia Alexeyevna has spoken a lot about the historical aspect of the development of our relations. Personally, I would like to cover to summarize the results of cooperating with the so-called independent Ukraine over the previous 30 years. Well, it is an open secret that they are trying to enter the European Union, and the European politicians are considering their future within the framework of the European Union. And they've been promising their citizens for many years the welfare, but starting since 1991 till 2022, early 2022, we see the situation to which the government of Ukraine has reduced their citizens over this period. Earlier, it used to be a well-developed industrial state, occupying the 17th place worldwide, being ahead of Poland or Argentina, for example, with regard to the GDP. It used to be a country of well-being. They had an industrial base with over 300 industrial branches, including heavy machine building, metal making, smeltering, etc. And of course, Ukraine used to be one of the largest European countries with regard to their population size. There used to be over 300,000 scientists in that state in the early 90s of the previous century. By the latest data, over October 2029, for the first time, Ukraine ranked last in Europe with regard to the GDP per head of the population, per capita. And with regard to their overall GDP, they went down 23 steps. And at the moment, the GDP is 2.5 times less than the GDP of Poland, for example. So as you see, they are inferior to all those countries whom they used to be superior to. And we see wild oligarchy capitalism, which ignores the rights of all citizens of Ukraine, with an exception of a small bunch of people who are well used to exploiting their common citizens and who are eating into the reserves which are remaining from the times of the former Soviet Union. We are all aware of the family names of the Ukrainian oligarchs. They are but a few. As to the rest citizens of Ukraine and those who are under direct genocide attacks in the Donbas territory, so practically every year and every month, they lose tremendous funds, and their quality of life is becoming poorer and poorer. And nowadays, we are not aware of at least one single find of the Ukrainian scientists, which are not 300,000, but 70,000 nowadays. By different data sources, those seeking a better life beyond the territory of Ukraine make from 3 to 10 million people. And maybe the guilty secret of the Ukrainian authorities is namely this figure, because this will show what is really happening in Ukraine. Because by the international data sources, by 2050, the outflow of the population from Ukraine is going to be their greatest social sore, their greatest evil. And unlike all other post-Soviet countries, who used to have a difficult time in the 1990s. So unlike all those countries, Ukraine is witnessing a second economic crisis, or PK, if I may put it so, because we see that at that period of time, there was a really drastic, very critical situation in Ukrainian economy. Speaking about the genocide in the Donbas region, I do insist that it is a real genocide, and even today, several civilians were killed, including a miner who was trying to get from the mine to his home place. So discussing this topic, we have to bear in mind that this is not just a problem of genocide with regard to the Donbas citizens. It is a real problem which has existed in Ukraine over the last 30 years. Thank you kindly. So the next speaker is going to represent the United States, John Mark Dugan.
5 years ago, and it's been very fascinating. I just wanted to make a comment, though, regarding fake news. It's very difficult to stop the spread of fake news because who's the arbiter of the actual truth? And I say this because Once I had an interview with a Russian television channel, and it was about American democracy. And I said in this interview that American democracy was under attack because big tech is censoring viewpoints that are critical of liberalism. And it was a threat to democracy. Well, they removed my video off my channel and gave me a strike saying that it was fake news. So anyways, I have a presentation up here that I have prepared. It's translated into Russian. Excuse any mistakes. I call it Big Trouble in Little Ukraine. Hold on one second. No. This is something is wrong here. Well, it's missing a page. Okay, well, Ukraine has a symbiotic relationship with the United States. In 3 decades of Ukraine's independence, a symbiotic relationship has formed between Ukraine and the USA. Corrupt American politicians give US taxpayer money to corrupt Ukrainian politicians. And Ukrainian politicians allow America to steal Ukrainian resources and give kickbacks to corrupt American politicians and corporations. Examples: the Biden family receiving large amounts of cash funneled through the corrupt Burisma Corporation. When a Ukrainian criminal corruption investigation was launched, Vice President Biden publicly threatened to withhold billions of dollars from Ukraine. The American military complex has set up at least 14 bioweapons labs and has been using Ukrainian people for bioweapons research. American pharmaceutical companies have been using Ukrainian citizens to test experimental drugs, which has resulted in the deaths of a large number of unsuspecting Ukrainians. Ukraine has now been torn apart by civil war and strife. I happen to like this photo on the top left. It's instead of an eagle, it's a vulture. America and NATO have been like vultures, feeding on the remains of what is left of Ukraine after fanning the flames of conflict. You know what America is doing in Ukraine is kind of like going to somebody's factory, starting a fire, and then charging firefighters for the water to put it out. Hold on a second. My mistake. The rise and fall of Ukraine. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became a story of success. Ukraine's economy showed steady growth. GDP grew by 5 to 10% per year. Ukraine's new friend, America, looked at the growing territory of Russia's western neighbor with ill-concealed attention. And now that Ukraine was economically strong with partnership relations with Russia, Ukraine was completely unprofitable for the West, and American politicians did not approve. Greedy American politicians and intel agencies had to act. At the end of 2004, dissatisfied with the election of Viktor Yanukovych, excuse me if I'm saying that improperly, the American intelligence community announced the falsification of election results. Quote, "It has become clear that the aggressive and powerful plan of fraud and abuse on the election day in a meeting with the authorities." And this was said by Richard Lugar, who's the chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee. The Orange Revolution ended with victory of the so-called pro-American Viktor Yushchenko, And there was a sharp reversal of Ukrainian domestic policy towards the West. Yushchenko started souring relationships with brother Russia by announcing intentions to join NATO, despite agreements signed in '92 that said Ukraine would never be allowed to join. Yushchenko began a campaign of stunning and aggressiveness towards the large Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. At the same time, none of the promised economic reforms were carried out. Yushchenko was in constant disagreement with Parliament and the Prime Minister to push Western policy. And in 3 years, from 2007 to 2009, inflation reached 50%. Yushchenko lost the credit of the public confidence, and in 2010, he only had about 5% of the vote. American politicians joined forces in Ukrainian corruption. Excuse me. Yushchenko had appointed corrupt officials to key positions, and oligarchs continued to pump resources to the West. The oil and gas sector was divided among American corporations. Since 2002, Burisma Holdings has been developing the most promising fields under the leadership of the American directors. And in 2014, the son of US Vice President Joe Biden joined their board. At the end of 2013, a contract was signed with Chevron for the shale and gas production for Western Ukraine. And by the end of 2013, it was ready to sign a similar agreement with another American company, ExxonMobil. A new leader tried to save Ukraine, but was unsuccessful. After Viktor Yanukovych took office, he tried to break out of the debt hole left, which Americans had driven Ukraine. Despite promises, the IMF refused to provide much needed money to Ukraine, putting it on the brink of collapse in the wintertime. After another deception by the United States, Yanukovych was forced to ask Moscow for funds. Russia agreed to issue $15 billion to Ukraine, and at the time, the gas price exceeded 400 per thousand cubic meters in Ukraine, and Russia agreed to $272 to $275. So this was a dramatic savings. The United States had not forgiven this decision by Yanukovych, who was trying to save his country from freezing. American-backed armed coup put oligarch Petro Poroshenko into power as Ukraine's president. Now, the U.S. plan to put pressure on Russia through Ukraine did not work, and the Ukrainian economy suffers. Moscow gave protection and humanitarian aid to Russian-speaking populations of Donbass, and managed to secure transit routes of Russian energy to European countries. With the commissioning of the South Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, Europe received reliable natural gas supplies, bypassing the territory of Ukraine, which had been blackmailing both Gazprom and European consumers for decades, with endless disputes over trans payments. After the launch of these pipelines, the Ukrainian revenue has been expected to fall by $1.2 billion, very large amount of money. Under agreements with Western creditors, Ukraine must now abandon any price restrictions on gas, heat, and hot water. And because of this, the IMF predicts that by next year, gas prices for the population will increase by 40%, transportation by 80%, and housing and communal services for Ukrainians will increase to over 200%. It's unsustainable for the Ukrainian people. Ukrainian leadership has, in policy, has catastrophically impoverished its own people. According to IMF calculations, over the next 6 years, the population of Ukraine will decrease by 1 million people, which is a real which is a real demographic catastrophe for a country of only 40 million people. And according to the same calculation, over 30 years, the reduction in the labor force will be 30%. By 2050, the country will face irreversible degradation in all directions. And whether by that time Ukraine exists as a state is a very big question. It's a gamble that is not paying off. Ukraine decided to become a bargaining chip in the geopolitical game of the United States against Russia. The Kiev authorities themselves have brought themselves to the very edge of the abyss by trusting, backstabbing, corrupt American and Ukrainian politicians. But not all Ukrainian politicians are bad. There's a lady by the name of Tetiana Pleshko.
И блогер по имени Татьяна Плачкова, члены парламента сказали, что Украина продала свою суверенность.
Ukraine's in a very dangerous position, and I can only hope for their future to be a better one. Thanks.
Да, спасибо большое. Следующий выступающий Дмитрий Родионов, российский политолог. Прошу вас.
Добрый вечер,
Now I
коллеги.
give the floor
Очень много
to Mr. Rodionov,
исторических аспектов.
and
Мне кажется, мы не
we
можем
have spoken so much
той темы, которая была изначально заявлена,
about the political aspects of the problem,
незаконного
but we were meant to talk about the anniversary of military coup in Ukraine.
вообще использовать этот термин.
I don't really know if we can use this term appropriately, illegal military coup. I think it's
Самое главное, чтобы все наши западные коллеги понимали,
repetitive because a military coup cannot be legal.
достоинство, как нас
But
пытаются
it is not
вывести из
a revolution of dignity as it has been labeled by the Western and Ukrainian propaganda, but it was a military coup led by and supported by nationalistic forces. And although some say, no, it is not nationalistic, look, they have a Jewish president, and the nationalistic forces could only secure very few places in Rada. And yet we see that the nationalistic rhetoric prevails. The people who say that it was the annexation of Crimea that inspired the anti-Russian sentiment, it is not true. At the very first Maidan of 2014, we heard a lot of, and there were a lot of memes that were openly anti-Russian and anti-Moscow. And Ukraine, some people say that Ukraine could have served as a bridge between Russia and the West, could have served as a neutral zone between the two. I disagree with that because Ukraine was a part of Russia that was quite artificially and violently torn apart. It could either be a part of Russia or be under its influence, or it would be its opponent. It started back in 1991 with the first slogan saying, let us stop feeding Moscow. Moscow is living off our resources, and so on. They tried to be economically and politically independent. And then came Yushchenko and the whole of rewriting of history, revisionist policies, and the anti-Russian, anti-imperial sentiment. Yanukovych did not try to save Ukraine, but during his administration and his government's, the process did slow down, but not stop. And the whole anti-Russia project started back in 1991, and with each succeeding president, it was going further and further. Back in 1992, at the first talks of independence, we could not imagine anything like war, anything like military action between the two countries. Today, what happened was that a bomb got into a Russian border post, and two vehicles with military personnel entered. And what happens if had this happened in between Mexico and the US? I think we would have seen a very different scenario. And now we're trying, and we're still trying to use political and diplomatic measures by recognizing Donbass republics and Lugansk republics. I'm not sure that that would actually save the day, but the Ukraine issue must be solved. Ukraine would never be neutral, will never be neutral, and will never be a bridge between Russia and Europe. But for the Nazi Germany, the only way to purge themselves from Nazism was to lose the war and go through repentance that followed. And it could be that Ukraine has no other way. These very minutes, a big session of Security Council of the Russian Federation is underway, reviewing the issue of recognition of the republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. The vice chair of Security Council has spoken. Valentina Matvienko is speaking now, and we are sitting here at the very same moment and using very similar language to that of Security Council. So we can see that the members of the expert community present here view the situation in the similar key, in the similar tone. And the issue of Ukraine can no longer be resolved by an agreement, by diplomacy, because Ukraine was seized by the West, and the neutrality was possible for Ukraine years ago had it been loyal to Russia, that had spent dozens of years building its industry, developing its infrastructure, investing in the development of this country. Ukraine was created by Russia, and its neutrality and independence were secured by Russia. And if it was the bridge and the neutral zone, it was created as such by Russia, that had heavily invested in in the Soviet Union times, and we wouldn't have needed such a neutral zone had the Eastern Europe still been its ally. In this case, having the military cooperation of Eastern Europe, Russia would not have needed any kind of neutral territory or bridge with Europe. But we have moved out from the Eastern Europe. We have left it willingly of our own accord, and leaving Eastern Europe, we tried to see such bridge, such buffing zone in Ukraine, a country that heavily populated with Russian-speaking people, and yet the West did not respect our willingness to resolve the situation peacefully, but came into Ukraine militantly, aggressively. We see that the West is seeking nothing but confrontation. We do not see any desire for partnership or collaboration. And there is no other option for the West. What happens to the Donbas region is but genocide, and the West has nothing else to offer to them. We will destroy you, the Russian-speaking population, the Russians at Donbas, or you shall flee. But to live in Ukraine, preserving their identity, is not seen as an option. Once and again, we see the same tactics of pure genocide, and also thinking about whether we need to support Ukraine as a state. We had been supporting them ever since 1991, providing them with gas at low prices, supporting their economy, collaborating with them. But are we really interested in Ukraine as an independent state? It has no value for us. It brings no benefit. For this state is an enemy state that has genocide of Russians as one of its policies. Now the Secretary of Security Council, Mr. Patrushev, is speaking at the session of the Security Council. We need to secure the right of Russians living in Donbas. But it's not only their destiny that is being discussed, but the destiny of the whole of Ukraine. How we're going to handle that, how we as an expert community shall present the situation to Russians. Will we be able to collaborate with Europe politically, economically, geopolitically, or will we always have this black hole between us that will constantly meddle in and will constantly present an obstacle to collaboration?
Позитивного сценария для Донбасса в составе Украины тоже нет. То есть это как бы чистый негатив, чистая черная дыра, и этот как бы такой нарост, это явление, такое, как украинская государственность, должно быть полностью устранено с геополитической карты Европы, что откроет полностью открытый путь взаимодействия между Россией и Европой на ближайшие столетия. Десятилетия не только десятилетий, но и столетий. Поэтому вот мы находимся в этом историческом моменте, в центре принятия исторических решений, которые происходят на наших глазах. И несмотря на то, что мы сидим уже больше 2 часов, я предлагаю еще задержаться на какое-то время, чтобы дождаться окончания вот большого заседания Совета Безопасности и засвидетельствовать здесь своим присутствием принятые решения, которые будут, я думаю, в ближайшие минуты озвучены. А пока что
And to stay here and to witness the decisions that will be made by the Security Council. But we decided we wanted first to run for 2 hours, but since this is a historic moment and we're expecting the decisions of the Security Council, we suggest continue, and probably we give the floor now to Tim Kirby.
English because, as they say, everyone's IQ is a lot higher in their native language, and no one can make fun of me for the way I speak except for the British and Californians. So, anyways, here is our situation today. Our big topic is 8 years of no progress with this situation in the Ukrainian crisis. That's what I was told the topic would be today. So I'm going to try to answer that question. One of the reasons that there's no progress is because Russia wants to make a deal, but Washington can't make a deal. That's a little bit of a word game there between can't and won't, but I would argue that can't is the better word. So here's why. If we look back a long time ago, which wasn't that long, there's still people alive who remember it, there was a big event when Russia, then the Soviet Union, and the West, the United States and Great Britain, had to make a big agreement about what to do over troubled territories. So we have a little bit of precedent here. That was the Yalta Conference and the entire process near the end and after World War II of how Europe and most of the world was going to be reorganized for the Cold War. Of course, there are some historians who say that the layout of the map that led to the Cold War was by accident, and there are some historians that say that Truman specifically, almost by design, created the Cold War, but that doesn't really matter. The fact is, it did. But the thing is that that process that happened at Yalta was between three leaders of the three major Allied powers who won World War II. Interestingly enough, there's a whole lot of the rest of the planet that wasn't there. No one cared what Portugal thought about this, or different places in Africa, or Australia, even for that matter. Didn't care, didn't matter. They weren't powerful, they weren't on the table, they weren't discussed. In fact, they're essentially non-actors. That's really, when we look at this whole Yalta layout, is essentially Great Britain and America being one entity. We have East versus West, and both East and West really couldn't pretend that the other wasn't powerful enough to do something. There was no way that the United States and Britain could have simply just told the Soviet Union, like, okay, well, we won the war. Sorry, guys, Hungary and Poland and Romania and all these other places, they're all going to be capitalist. Too bad you guys lost 27 million people for nothing. That didn't happen, okay? That didn't work. That was impossible. Now, the thing that is different today is that Russia finds itself in this negotiation process in the same position as Portugal or Australia did during the Yalta Conference, is that Washington has to hold on to this monopolar world. I know when you're talking to people in Russia, the whole monopolar versus multipolar world thing, it's become maybe even a bit of a cliche. It's mentioned very often, but that's because it's so true and so relevant. Because if Washington were to just go to the Russians, okay, you know, those offers that you sent us in the beginning of January 2022 about where NATO should be, essentially how we're going to divide spheres of influences going forward, okay, let's agree to something and work it out. All of a sudden, that means that the monopolar world is dead. That very moment that they sign on the dotted line with the Russians, it's over. And that's something that's very difficult to give up on. And it's one of the reasons why no matter what the Russians try to do, Washington simply is incapable of being able to make an agreement. And that is why we're stuck. So when we're in this position, what kind of hope can we have? There's one sort of moment of hope that you guys may all find, or you gentlemen and ladies should find very strange, but let me express it. One of the members of the Atlantic Council just wrote a piece for Foreign Policy in which he said that the United States must prepare for war with both Russia and China. Now, touching into a little bit of what John said here about corruption, the main thing they said about this double war between Russia and China wasn't some sort of overall strategy. It wasn't something about, the American values or whatever on the global stage and all that. It was about the money. He just said, we need to double the military budget. 750 billion is too much. We need about 1.5 trillion. And that gives me hope, because hopefully the real issue of one of the reasons why the United States, the powers that be, don't want to back off of the monopolar world, there is an ideological component to that. But I think a lot of it is sort of the financial component. Because if someone happened to get lucky and their father was rich and they grew up in a mansion, even if they blow all their money and they get into financial trouble, they're going to do everything they can to stay in that mansion. And I think that that's what's happening here. So in a strange way, what Russia really could offer the West is not Cold War 2.0 in a negative way, but the opportunity for the wonderful corruption earnings of a Cold War 2.0. That is really possibly the only thing that could make Washington happen, because that would turn losing the monopolar world into which is probably going to happen inevitably, or at least that's the Russian perspective of things. You're free to think as you like. But if it is an inevitability, that changes this dark, dismal inevitability into a new, wonderful earning opportunity. So that's one thing where I wish the powers that be in Russia who are involved in this would listen to people like me and start to think a little bit more pragmatically, because I can tell you one thing. This is not an insult to anyone in this room. It's not a criticism of you. It's not devaluing the value of human beings. But I can tell you one thing. In Washington, no one cares about statistics, how many people have been murdered, by what means, over what. There's a component to the human mind where one of the reasons why human beings can be very brutal is when something becomes a question of numbers, of sending 1,000 soldiers there, 50,000 there, do this, do that. We really can sort of lose our humanity, and you're not going to win over Washington that way. Offering Washington something that will motivate them to go away from the monopolar world, like I just said, would be good. Option B, again, the January offer that the Russians actually did of offering Washington, hey, let's cut up Europe and you're going to get 90% of it. I thought that that was actually going to be good enough, because that's really what Russia said. It was essentially, we would like to maybe take back half of Ukraine and maybe have control over Moldova and Georgia, and everything in Europe, lock, stock, and smoking barrel, would go to Washington. And yet they still didn't agree. So guys, it's tough, but this is the reason why there can be no progress. Because even with that, if Washington can't even agree to taking 90% of Europe, well, Lavrov's going to be smoking a lot of cigarettes. And that's all I have to say for today. If anyone would like to talk to me after this or get in touch with me, I'd be happy to give out my contact details or whatever. I'm also very open to criticism. Thank you very much.
Да, спасибо большое. Следующий выступающий Леонид Савин, главный редактор портала «Геополитика».
Now we give the floor to Leonid Savin, editor-in-chief of Geopolitica.
Well, good afternoon. I would like to render my support to Mr. Rodionov, because since 1990s, the situation has been aggravating, and it was happening right in front of my eyes, literally, because at that period of time, I used to be present on the territory of Ukraine, and I noticed an alliance of liberals with the Ukrainian nationalists. Liberals more worked with grantors from the West, like the Soros Foundation, the foundations from Western embassies, who used to create networks on the territory of regional centers and try to enroll as contractors young people. And The first financial support was rendered by the Western organizations, including the Embassy of the United States, the Embassy of Canada, and it allowed to give a start-up to develop these ideas. And one of the first color revolutions, which took place in 2004, when there was a several percent difference between votes in favor of Yushchenko and Yanukovych, it became obvious that the situation was much poorer and more critical because there was a demographically problematic southeast, which has always been pro-Russian. And the prime minister who ran for presidency had effect in his favor. It was making the Russian language the second national official language of the country, although he failed to fulfill this promise. And it was not the only promise which he failed to fulfill. And it was Viktor Yanukovych who signed an agreement with the North Atlantic Alliance. So we see a so-called landslide towards the Western values, towards the policy which was imposed on the part of Brussels and Washington. And whatever we do and whatever we have done, it would have kept on happening because it was impossible to keep on further the status of Ukraine. And we had the information about Ukrainians who tried to contract militaries in Kosovo, in Albania. Those were warlords. For them to be brought to the border of Ukraine. It was sort of a baptism of fire in North Iraq. And of course, we should bear in mind the events in Syria. Anti-Assad organizations keep on mimicking and multiplying their Turkey also took part in the process of supplying warlords and contractors towards the borderline of Ukraine. So there are a lot of countries which pursue destructive policy. So, as you see, Ukraine as a state supports their strategy. When Prussia was done away with during the Second World War as a sovereign state, maybe it is time now to do away with the sovereignty of Ukraine for the reason of such a behavior. Which is revealed in terrorism and in efforts and even in obvious real actions, which can be characterized as genocide. And I do hope that today we shall take the correct decisions. And judging by the news which we are currently receiving, the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic are expecting to be acknowledged as independent states. Well, so let's hope for the positive development of the events. So the next speaker is going to be Mr. George Pierce from the United States. Is he available? No, he's not available. Oh, yes, here he is, George Pierce. You're welcome.
I want to tell you about the forgotten middle-class workers in America and how they could be best courted to form a reliable partner in a struggle for a multipolar world. I'll be 60 years old this week, and I've been an automation specialist for over 40 years. I've done contract projects in many factories, large and small, all over the country. I do not have a university degree. In the U.S., we still had the remains of a naturally evolved, locally managed production industries. This sector has been diminishing in the last few generations, and now it's almost completely gone. In this antique system, experience and results are regarded as superior to a university engineering degree.
In America, there are millions of working class people who are being managed against their own values and against their own best interests. In most places, especially large corporations, it is no longer just about safety and production, but about the corporate policy is increasingly dictating how you can interact with other people, what you're allowed to say, what you're allowed to believe, and even think. Highly skilled craftsmen are being replaced with quotas of women and minorities that have no leverage for negotiation. They're interchangeable and paid much smaller wages. Most of the automation technology that I've installed is designed to accommodate this. I saw that. Often the results are more waste, damaged equipment, and inefficiency. The feedback loop to upper management is highly filtered, and the few remaining people like me are brought around to put out fires and try to make things work despite the forced implementation of overweening ideologically driven corporate fantasies. These ideological fantasies can be described as a new colonialism based on deception. Competition is eliminated, resources are taken from the people without pain. Even labor is kept in a state where there's no choice but to work for less than survival wages with no obligations on the part of the employers. This plan is eventually to be implemented worldwide in the New World Order. Ukraine, I think, is going to be a prototype. I worked as a military contractor in Afghanistan for 4 years, in Iraq in 2, and I noticed how the military system works, the money carousel. There are millions of American workers who are being disenfranchised and put under pressure to comply with the very ideologies that are eliminating them. The true left is non-existent in America. It has been replaced by a circus of identity politics focused exclusively on race and gender. This process began early in the 80s and has now reached such an absurd intensity that it's beginning to collapse from its own internal contradictions. The collapse is welcome, but it will not be pretty. There is no official structure that represents a true right in America either. The entire edifice has been captured by what can only be described as a corporate stooge version of Zionist Trotskyism that spends all her energy clutching her pearls and screeching about the hypocrisy of the left, blaming China, Russia, Muslims in general, communists, and Iran for what their own corporate backers are doing. Even paleoconservatives have become nothing more than corporate shills. There's nothing new under the sun. I am reminded once again where Trotsky got his $20 million. What is needed is clear. Being anti-left or anti-right, anti-elite, or even anti-globalist is not enough. I think the best plan for the future is to describe a social architecture that will support local control and supervision of media, police, economic, and political power. These multiple local architectures can indeed be standardized to work together seamlessly in a regional system. The beginnings of this alternative system can be organized only after inspiring the tired, confused, and severely weakened middle class with a new vision, a shining city on a hill, a city of locally based political power that protects the dignity and organic self-directed communities. A shining city on a new more multipolar world. I have written a book of musings and thoughts in this direction several years ago. The title is Unified Separatism. I'm undegreed, self-educated engineer, not an academic, but I think it's worth a read. I think what's needed now is to show this disenfranchised American middle class something inspiring, something to attain to, something they'll desire, something they already desire. I know they desire it, to show them how beautiful it can be, that it can be possible to attain it, and how to start organizing for the first steps. Thank you.
Большое спасибо. Прошу, Дарья Александровна Платонова.
Thank you so much. And now I give the floor to Daria Platonova. This is a historic moment. Those of you who are following the news feeds, you see that pretty much all the heads of Russian government are calling for recognition of Donbas and Lugansk republics, and President Putin has already spoken in favor of that. Today we have spoken some issues of local importance, the genocide against Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, and also we spoke about the geopolitical conflict and juxtaposition of various blocs in Europe and in the world. So those of you who follow geopolitical studies can predict what is going to happen, and many of the participants of the expert community today follow the trends and pretty much know what's going to happen. We will see the strengthening of NATO bloc and the attempts to violate the Eurasian border, and all of it follows the geopolitical logic. But if during the Cold War the conflict was between the two ideologies, communist and liberalist, today the conflict is phrased differently. On the one side, we see liberal rhetoric that is becoming more and more anti-human. And on the other side, we see the call for multipolarity, for plurality. Russia is no longer the seat of communism and communist ideology, but what we call for is a multipolar world that has no ideology to impose on the world, but that respects the diversity and the differences. And our policies towards the Eastern countries and the Asian countries is based on respect for that diversity, is also in the spirit of multipolarity. We do not impose our rules. We do not impose any kind of democracy on these countries. But we wanted to see how the people of Donbass and Lugansk want to see their future. I looked at European media. I researched French media. They tend to focus on some marginal issues like the role of Macron in regulating the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or some other marginal issues. But we see the Anglo-Saxon influence even in the European media. On the one hand, we see a strife for truth and objectivity. On the other hand, we see strong censorship and sanctions and restrictions imposed against those who are not in sync with the imposed propaganda. But I would also like to state that in order to govern any country from the outside, you need to invest years and years in changing the worldview of its people. And we see that having happened in Ukraine. How little by little the public opinion of Ukraine was changed over the years, modified, and to the point that last year no, in 2020 at a film festival was presented a film of Ukrainian forces participating in D-Day and the LGBTQ Ukrainian military personnel participating in the Allied invasion and the Allied forces. And sometimes we see the nuances present in some films, in publications, in cultural events that and some of these date back years. We see that Kiev is quite militant, and the genocide that is happening, what we see in news feeds, is already a war going on. And a while ago, we have seen the papers on preparing psychological war, the guidelines for Ukrainian personnel, on tactics to be used in social media, in mass media, in order to prepare the public opinion for destabilizing the situation and for special events and for military action as well. What is going on in Ukraine right now and what is going on in Donbass is a geopolitical strategy that had been prepared by Americans for years and years and years. Unfortunately, the poor people of Donbass are now in the middle of that. And they have to go through their trials and tribulations at no fault of their own. But us as experts, journalists, bloggers, we should try our best to present the true situation as it happens in the region. And even now I see the imbalance in how the information is presented in Russian media and in the Western media. The West in presenting what is going on at Security Council now are trying to reduce it to memes that could be used to present Russia as militant and evil. What we can do is at least speak the truth. At the very least, what we can do is not to take the words out of context, but to present the statements and messages in their fullness. Thank you. And the last speaker for today would be Luca Bilardi. I'm giving you 5 minutes here.
So I would like to, since we spoke a lot about Ukraine, I would like to address maybe a little bit more about a broader issue, which is the transition that we are experiencing over the world. It's not just like Europe, it's not just the US. We're experiencing this transition. It's called the green economy transition, and how it is occurring, and the reason why we are experiencing also this confrontation between the West and Russia. I will try to explain myself. Basically, there are something called transnational finance that is backing this major shift in the world economies. They are, for example, we have the von der Leyen, who has named BlackRock as the main leader for the shift in Europe. The green economy, of course, wants to eliminate everything that is carbon, meaning all the oil and gas supplies and industry which are related to that. Of course, this green economy has nothing to do with anything green. They actually want to run on nuclear energy. Therefore, I know, it's a bit difficult to call it green. Still, that's the propaganda. What to me is occurring is that they absolutely need to stop Russia providing gas to Europe. It's not possible that that cheap gas goes to Europe. They need to stop this at any cost, and also dismantle all the national elites which are tied to the oil and gas industry, and for that they will probably need a shock. They won't just convince them like to step down and give up to their massive empires. They will need probably a war. They are ready, to me, they are ready to throw Europe and Russia into a war, and also the US into a major global war in order to completely change the face of the economy. They won't stop because they have to do it. They have to do it now, and this is my, this is how I read the current situation. Also, it occurs to me that NATO is seen as a obsolete military complex structure, and it needs to be dismantled too. President Macron already said many times that we need a European army, right? What I think is that the financial forces, they do not control NATO completely. There's still some resistance inside, and they need to dismantle it and control it through smaller mercenaries armies. Like in this case, the European sort of army would do. It would be totally fully controlled by these powers, and therefore this is what they will probably do: throw every country into war, and then lead peace conferences afterwards and dismantle everything that needs to be dismantled. So that's my reading about the situation. Thank you very much for listening.
Ну что, коллеги, заканчиваем наше мероприятие. Хочу вас проинформировать.
Well, in conclusion of our session, you know that at the same time there was a session of Security Council going on, and I would like to read just a few quotes from the Russian policymakers who all supported recognition of Lugansk and Donetsk republics. President Putin said that the decision will be made today, and I would like to quote Valentina Matvienko of the Federation Council, calling the situation in Donbass a humanitarian catastrophe, including genocide and blockade. Vyacheslav Volodin, the head of State Duma, said that with 351 votes of State Duma, the State Duma is appealing to the president of Russia to recognize Lugansk and Donetsk Republic. Many policymakers spoke on the unwillingness and procrastination of Kiev in bringing the Minsk agreement into action. saying that Ukraine is not going to follow Minsk agreements, and in personal dialogues, although officially they do not state that, but in private conversations, they say that they're not going to follow the Minsk agreements, and the Ukrainian forces that are now at the borders of Donbass is comparable in scope to the General Guderian's forces used at the same territory during the World War II. And NATO is shipping arms to these forces, and these actions do not give us an option. And one of our policymakers says that this is the only conflict currently in the world where one of the countries openly rejects speaking to the other and does not want to negotiate. I thank all of you who participated in our session today, and we're planning another session soon, and we extend the invitation to all of you. Thank you.